With us now, Mattias Westman. He invests mainly in Russia. Mattias is CEO of Prosperity Capital Management, where he manages $4 billion. Last year, Bloomberg Markets ranked Mattias and his Prosperity Fund second on a list of top-performing large hedge funds. You're in New York this morning, Mattias, for the Bloomberg Markets 50 Summit. The 50, you are, according to one of our publications, our esteemed colleagues at Bloomberg Markets, one of the 50 most influential people in finance. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So let's begin the conversation by asking you not just about Russia, but about the BRICS, so to speak, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And many people raise concerns about, particularly in China and India, about the rising risk of inflation, and especially in the case of China, an artificially weak currency. Is it a growing risk in your opinion?
Well, I think inflation is a pretty significant risk around the world, since central banks everywhere are trying to undermine their currencies by printing a lot of money. I think mainly, actually, the emerging markets have been much more conservative than the developed markets on this front. But you know, in a fast-growing economy like that, and one which is very dependent on commodities also, then inevitably you're going to have a little bit higher inflation than you do elsewhere.
Not much of an inflation problem outside the emerging world. You said everywhere. I mean, I don't see inflation. I mean, in the medium term, as a policymaker, we've got temporary, transitory impact of inflation now, but inflation is going to plummet in the US and in Europe, presumably not in the emerging world.
Well, I mean, we disagree about that, but the inflation is actually coming down, particularly in Russia. You will see a quite sharp decline in inflation now because of a better functioning economy.
When you say you disagree with Danny, on which point? You feel like there's not going to be deflation here in the US or in Europe?
As soon as we have a little bit more confidence back in the economy and velocity of money increases, I think there's a high risk of continued high inflation. We've seen, elevated rates for a couple of years already.
It was not that long ago people were talking about oil as a potential hedge against inflation in addition to gold. Oil has been very volatile. I don't need to tell you that, Mattias, but I do notice that many of your top holdings are in oil companies. Yeah. Is it for that reason or for perhaps another reason?
Well, there are several reasons. One, of course, is that the oil price has been quite high and still is, and we think that demand for all these consumable commodities is going to remain very strong. The Russian oil companies trade at P's around 4. And even if, in the worst case, the oil price half, they will probably have still have single-digit P's.
How susceptible do you think these countries are to slow growth in Europe and the US? I mean, in some sense, what we've talked about is these countries are sort of separate and they're fine. But it was a great worry to me that the crisis will spread. It'll just spread slowly. How much do you think they really can be separate and be strong, or just be pulled down if Europe and the US are weak?
Well, it depends a little bit how bad it is, but I would take them in two groups, of course. Russia and Brazil are much more dependent on demand in other emerging markets like China, whilst China and India are more dependent on the developed market demand. So there are some significant differences in exposure there.
And presumably countries like Australia. I mean, Australia's boomed because China's boomed. Yeah. But if China weakens, we know what would happen to Australia. So the worry is that everything is very interrelated. It's just if we look at, it's like we've got two separate worlds. And my worry is that they're not really separate.
Well, in a really bad scenario, of course, they're not separate. Everything has a correlation of 1 at that point. Right. But I think in a medium scenario, then there are big differences. And even amongst the emerging markets or commodity economies like Australia is dependent more on investment in China, whilst Russia arguably is dependent more on consumption in China. So there are differences.
Mattias, you had to have a view that led you to take the positions that did so well last year. Has that investment thesis changed at all?
Well, no, and I think we're talking about commodities and so on here, and that is an important part of the Russian investment story. But the most important thing, which people don't realize, is just what's going on the company levels. These are real businesses. They used to be Soviet production units, and now real entrepreneurs coming in with modern management techniques and improving these companies immensely. So we're bottom-up stock pickers. We're looking for management teams of owners who can really turn these companies around.
How much, I was just going to say, do you worry about the integrity of the data? We know that's obviously has been a risk in the past for Russian companies.
Well, we operate with quite a large margin of safety in our investments. So, and I would say that we've had lots of corporate governance problems over the years, but accounting hasn't really been one of them. So we feel quite confident with it. I mean, obviously, there are exceptions, but in general, that's not really been a big problem.
Good.
Mattias, good to see you. Mattias Westman of Prosperity Capital Management, named by Bloomberg Markets Magazine one of the best performing major hedge funds.